Well. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Revelation Hour Fireside Chat. This evening, our first edition, where we're going to be packed with a very interesting topic today, as we're going to be talking about the election of Donald Trump and everything that comes with it. It's lovely to have you here this evening with us as well, and I hope that you will enjoy, and please have questions ready. I'm sure our guests will be happy to answer all your questions. So we here to really talk about Donald Trump election, and hopefully we'll be able to understand where we are. And second term, I can't believe it. I think when I heard the news, I had a feeling that was potentially going to happen for many reasons, but I think it was still a bit of a shock, and I'm sure it was a bit of a shock for everyone here. So what I want to do now, I just want to play a quick video, 40 seconds, and then we're going to dive straight into the topic with our guest this evening. So let's watch this quick video.
The Fox News decision desk can now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States.
The former president's comeback will be complete with a win in Wisconsin, a state that he narrowly lost 4 years ago. He is now the second president in U.S. history to win non-consecutive terms. The first was Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. Senator J.D. Vance will become the 50th vice president.
Wow. 47 one. I mean, a second term, you've got to give credit to Donald Trump for what he's done, actually. But I really wanted this evening to invite you and invite our guest here, Martyn Whittock, which is a columnist and an historian as well. He's been with us on the show many times, and I want him to share our views, his views on the election here. So let's welcome Martyn. Good evening, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, very good. It's good to have you with us this evening to talk about the election, about Donald Trump, the aftermath, and also what we're going to be looking at in his new administration. I'm sure that's going to be something a little bit different that has been previously. So just tell us for our listening here. So we've got people on Zoom this evening, we've got people on Facebook, people on YouTube as well, listening as well, and they may have some questions for you as we go along. But you know, what is different about this election compared to the previous one? I don't know whether you can just give us a little bit of an information about it.
Well, it has certainly been quite a turn up for the books. As you say, this is only the second person in US history to win 2 non-consecutive terms. In other words, president, then not president, and then president again. Sometimes, of course, we have presidents who win 2 terms. They can only have 2 terms anyway. But this is very unusual. It's only ever happened once before, Grover Cleveland in the 1890s, to be president, then lose an election, then come back. And in 2021, it really did look as if it was the end of Donald Trump. He'd lost the election to Joe Biden in 2020. We'd had all the sort of situations to do with the Capitol insurrection and riots there on 6th of January 2021. There were big criticisms of him by the Republican Party, many of whom have been really threatened by that invasion of the Capitol building. But he's come back from that in the most extraordinary way. I think basically many Republican leaders, both in Congress and in the Senate, realized that the base support for Donald Trump had not been affected by his losing of the election in 2020. They were not turned off by what happened on January the 6th. There was a perception amongst many very strong Trump supporters that the election had been stolen from their man. And what we rapidly saw was leaders of the Republican Party basically reorganizing themselves around Donald Trump and coming back to Donald Trump because they realized in many ways that he wasn't going to go away and that he had huge support from many members in what you might call the Republican base. And they basically came to terms with him again. And although the midterms did not go well for Trump candidates in 2022, his traction has increased and increased ever since then. And that has been really quite extraordinary. I guess basically why did the Democrats lose? Why did he win? I think there are a number of interpretations. One is the Democrats just did not pay sufficient attention to the southern border and illegal immigration. That's concerned many, many Americans, and Trump has obviously majored on that hugely. There's been a perception by many Americans that inflation is really, really bad, and clearly it is a problem. And the arguments that jobs have been secured, that people are in work, has not, if you like, dulled the edge of people's anger about prices at the gas station and at the store. And the latest demographic information tends to show that young black men who it was thought could be lost to Trump pretty much voted for Harris in the same sort of proportions as they had voted before for Biden. But the huge flood of women voters, which was thought would come behind Harris, simply didn't happen. College-educated women tended to vote for Harris. People who'd not gone to college, who were women, tended to drift towards Trump. So that huge breakthrough into women voters didn't happen. And the really big change was Latino voters, people whose origins are in South America, Mexico, South America, and they swung behind Trump really very significantly. Why did that happen? Well, partly because, I guess, concerned about inflation, concerned about the border, but also there's a perception that they were very, very negative towards the idea of a female president. And so they really moved away from Harris. having been moving a bit away from Biden before that, but before that having been pretty strongly behind Obama. So for one reason or another, there's been a quite extraordinary turnaround. And a couple of weeks ago, people were thinking, well, maybe Harris would do it, but it's quite clear as the elections unfolded that a tsunami of support for Trump had happened, such that he did extremely well in the popular vote and in the Electoral College, which is the American constitutional system. And at the moment, we have a situation where Republicans will control the House. That's the House of Representatives. They will control the Senate. The House of Representatives actually by a very narrow margin, but they will still control it. And they will have the presidency too. So it really has been quite an extraordinary turnaround. And as I say, those are perhaps some of the reasons why it happened and caught a lot of people out. But the key thing is, it has happened. And that really is quite extraordinary.
Well, that's quite interesting that you're saying it has indeed happened. And I think one of the things that I think it took everybody by surprise, mostly from the outside, from the States, but it's quite interesting how you put it out. You know, why did a woman, I mean, you mentioned the woman turned more towards Trump, and as you mentioned, the reason they're quite very reticent to vote for Harris. But do you think that her policies as well were not quite attractive? Because I have the perception that a lot of the Americans felt that Donald Trump may be more suited in terms of to bring the economy back to the United States compared to Harris, which just didn't seem to have a plan in that sense. Am I correct or not?
Yeah. Rightly or wrongly, the perception has definitely been that Trump will do better for them in terms of bringing prices down, that Trump will do better in terms of perhaps tariffs on goods coming in from, let's say, China and other countries as well. Of course, that's a two-edged sword, of course, because if you end up in a tariff war globally, then you'll have massive inflation and you'll have lack of goods, and there'll be problems for jobs. But that has not yet happened yet. And so the perception is, rightly or wrongly, that prices will come down under Trump, that American jobs will be protected from foreign imports under Trump, and that therefore that will be good for American working people. As I say, it comes with a huge risk, because obviously if, for example, Trump puts, I don't know, let's say a 40% tariff on Chinese goods, then China will retaliate. If he falls out with other world big players like the EU, they'll be forced to retaliate, and before you know where you are, you end up with a tariff war, and you end up with inflation and big jobs. So you loss of jobs. So you could have a situation in 4 years' time which is much worse than now. But at the moment, the promise is protection of America, America first, keeping out cheaper foreign goods, and that protecting the American economy, as it were. But whether that will work out, of course, only time will tell. But clearly, a lot of people bought into that promise and believe that might be the case. And they basically punished the Democrats for not being active enough on inflation as they saw it, not being active enough on the southern border. That's caused real concern, the huge influx of people from, particularly from South America, but elsewhere across the southern border. That's been a real weakness for the Democrats. They've been perceived as not being strong enough on that. And so issues like what will happen to Ukraine, or what will happen to the Middle East, or what will happen to global relationships, I think actually, although our listeners and viewers may be very interested in that, I actually think that probably didn't play very highly in many Americans' decisions, because notoriously American voters do not seem to be highly influenced by foreign policy decisions. I think mostly it was domestic, I think.
That's very interesting, and that's the question I was coming to. Donald Trump returned, 2. We can call it 2.0 or whatever we want to call it, but what does it mean for the world? We don't really know, because he's a type of person that you don't know what to expect from him in that sense, and I think this is why most of the European, even though they congratulated him, for his return, they were, a lot of them, quite skeptic about what's going to happen, because as you imagine, we're still a war in Ukraine. There's still the major conflict in the Middle East. The trade with China is still quite prevalent, and it's quite interesting. I was filming an event this all day today, and they were actually talking about the impact of Trump election, for the economy. So what does it mean for the world, Trump be reelected in that sense?
The challenge of President Trump is, whether you like him or loathe him, and obviously, viewers and listeners will have different views on him. He's rather Marmite, as we say. other breakfast spreads are also available. But you either really like him or you really don't like him. There aren't many people in the middle that go, "Oh, I'm not so sure about President Trump or Donald Trump." He tends to divide people. But I think what most people have to admit is that he's a highly unpredictable candidate, a very highly unpredictable politician. So it's very, very difficult to know what will happen. Now, in one sense, that may have positive effects for American foreign policy, because you may find people, like Russia, like China, like Iran, playing it really carefully, because it's kind of what's sometimes called the madman theory of politics. The idea is, the guy's crazy. We don't know what he's going to do. We've got to be really, really careful. And it's sometimes called the madman theory of politics. It's not just something I've invented for Donald Trump. And so therefore that might play well for American foreign policy. On the other hand, world trade likes certainty and likes reliability. So the idea of volatility is not good for world trade. So that's not good for buying and selling goods and so on. And then things like Ukraine, we just don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, it may well be that Trump, who is kind of the master of the deal as he sees it himself, is going to say to them, right, this is the deal on offer. Ukraine must agree to lose some land. Russia can't have everything it wants. Therefore, this is the kind of compromise that you've got to accept. Now, alternatively, you might say on Ukraine, you've got to accept. Now, or alternatively, but if he feels, on the other hand, how many hands can you have? On the other hand, if he feels that Putin is playing him, then he might act very strongly towards Putin. So it's very difficult to predict. And that, I guess, is why particularly Ukraine is very concerned, because they wanted to see a continued support for them in their battle against Russia. And with Trump, it's kind of just uncertain. Will he, won't he? Europeans are very concerned. And that's Europeans, not just the EU. I mean, we're part of Europe. We're part of NATO. They're concerned because they're thinking, well, will he continue to support NATO, but just demand that NATO countries pay more of their dues, which is not unreasonable, I hasten to add, or will he kind of semi-pull out of NATO, in which case, oh, wow, that'll be a real change of things, because America's been a major player in NATO since its formation after the Second World War. In the Middle East, where will he stand in the Middle East? That's a really big question. I mean, his United Nations ambassador, Elise Stefanik, is a staunch ally of Israel. The Arkansas governor, Mike Huckabee, who looks like he's going to be the next US ambassador to Israel, very, very strong supporter of Israel. So does that mean we're going to see very, very strong support for Israel and no criticisms at all of the Netanyahu government and how it behaves? Does that mean to say that he's going to create deals between Israel and more of its neighbors? For example, the Abraham Accords that were emerging under late Trump when he was first president look set to normalize relationships between Israel and a number of its key neighbors, in the Arab states. But on the other hand, if you totally ignore the Palestinian situation, then you're going to have a continual instability and problems and threat of violence coming against Israel, because obviously, Palestinians and their needs and aspirations, cannot just be ignored. So if America just ignores that, is it actually just kicking the problem further down the road? And does it ultimately undermine Israel's security? Big questions, big questions.
This is very interesting, Martin, what you're saying. And before I continue, I want to invite our listeners on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube, whatever platform you are, please just write your question on the chat. And as your question are written, we've been reading them out so we can try to answer those questions to you. As you mentioned, there's a big kind of question mark about what he's going to do next, in that sense, and that could have repercussion in the world, especially where we are at the moment. There's a question I wanted to ask you here in relation to his election, because it's something a little bit different than other. Usually when you got an election, maybe they have part of the Senate and maybe they have part of the Congress, but it seemed to have access not to everything here. For what I'm reading from the article, he is not able to actually kind of forge or map the economy or the policies of the United States without having too much opposition. Am I correct?
Well, that's an interesting point, you see. I mean, I think the thing is, Trump always posits himself as being the outsider. I mean, obviously, he's a very, very wealthy man. We mustn't sort of think this is like log cabin to to White House. This is a really very, very wealthy man, wealthy businessman. He's not an ordinary guy, but he presents himself as being a non-politician. And I think that's his very, very strong suit. Whatever you think about that as an advantage or not, it certainly has played really well with the American public, who felt disillusioned with politics, but disillusioned with professional politicians. And he's done very well on that. The key is, can he create the kind of movement forward which actually will bring some kind of stability to the USA? Now, he's more likely to be able to get his policies passed because there is a, as I say, fairly thin but still Republican majority emerging. Well, it's there now in the House. He's got a majority in the Senate, and obviously he holds the White House. So he has the real possibility of making his policies happen. Very often American presidents find that they can't get things through one or other of the various different aspects of the American political system. They might hold Congress, but they don't hold the Senate, or they might have a majority in the Senate, but they don't hold the House of Representatives. Well, he's got all three. So in some ways, there's nothing to stop Trump from actually making Trump policies happen. So over the next year or two, we really will see things change, I think. I think there'll be a big cut back on federal budget. I mean, he's named Musk, for example, and Ramaswamy as people he wants to look at the federal budget. That's going to be big cuts. But how is that going to impact on ordinary Americans? Only time will tell. It's very easy to say we're going to cut back on red tape and cut back on American expenditure. But if it shuts your library or closes your school or causes problems in your environment, then that's going to be an issue. So will that be an issue? Only time will tell. He said it doesn't matter how much it costs to sort out the immigrant situation and forcibly move immigrants, illegal immigrants, those who are undocumented migrants, out of America. Now, is that going to work? When that actually comes to, shifting mums and dads and kids who've maybe been in America for 10 years, will people have second thoughts about that then? Will the cost of it be prohibitive? Will there be conflict between the Trump administration and the Democrat-run states and who have Democrat governors, for example? And obviously they're Democratic elected too. But he has the potential to put into play Trump policies because he does have what's called a trifecta. That is, all the three elements of American government. He's got them all. He's got the Senate. He's got the House. He's got the presidency. Now that's what's called a trifecta. He's got all three of those, so he's got a better chance of making things actually happen. So the jury is out as to what it will be, but clearly he has been elected with some very high expectations of change. Now, whether he can deliver, again, particularly because, he can be a rather chaotic candidate as well. Well, we just don't know. But at the moment, it is interesting days, as they say.
Very interesting. Feel free to ask your question as we carry on this topic. One of the things that I wanted to mention as well, there was a video that was passing around and I was watching, and the element of transgenders and in United States, and we kind of didn't really know, for example, what Harris' views were on this aspect of it. But from a biblical perspective, Trump seemed to be very strong on gender, for what we understand.
Yes, it's interesting because Trump has been on something of a journey. In his earlier life, he registered as a Democrat, funnily enough. He's not always been a Republican. And many people would have regarded him as being relatively a social liberal. He was pro-choice at one point. And he certainly has never fallen out with publicly in the past, in his past, with gay rights activists, and hasn't had very strong views on this. He said things that have offended people, but he hasn't had very clear views on this. But what he has done is he's kind of moved significantly, basically behind the Republican viewpoint and also behind the evangelical viewpoint in the USA. So he's shown himself to be very critical of trans rights, for example. He's been less vocal on LGBTQ plus rights, I hasten to add. It's not clear where he stands on that. On abortion, of course, he's put conservative judges into the Supreme Court, which meant that the 1973 Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision has been overthrown, and that means that there's no longer a constitutional right to abortion. Now, that obviously has got a support from a lot of Christians of all persuasions, both Catholics and evangelicals in the USA. But it's also proved to be very, very unpopular. A number of states have now found that they've been challenged about it at the ballot box. It's now become a constitutional right in a number of states. And Trump himself has rode back from that, saying, oh, it's up to the states now. I'm not going to impose a federal, or not going to encourage, or I'm not going to support a federal ban on abortion, because there are some Republicans who would like there to be what's called primary legislation. That means basically laws passed within Congress and then signed into law, agreed by the Senate, signed into law by the president, which would, if you like, ban abortion, or virtually ban abortion across the USA. Now, whatever people think about that, that's highly unlikely to happen, because Trump knows that that's very, very unpopular with a great deal of American people. Just it's very popular with some in the American population. And he said, no, we've batted it back to the states. It's up to the states now. So if California want to do it their way, or if Massachusetts want to do it their way, that's up to them. But if Arkansas or Georgia or Texas or Florida want to do it their way, now that's up to them. But that's obviously going to disappoint people within particularly the evangelical right in the USA that wanted there to be an abortion ban, federal abortion ban. I don't think he's going to support that, because I think, Trump is the master of the deal, and he realizes that is still very, very unpopular amongst many, many people across the USA, even people who may be Republican women, who may have even voted for him. And not going to be supporting that. So we really have quite an interesting situation here, where he's carried out a number of policies that have been very, very popular with what's sometimes called the evangelical right in the USA. Although it should always be remembered that he's much, much more popular amongst white evangelicals than he is amongst black evangelicals. And that's a really interesting thing, because we tend to look at some of these things and say, well, that's been done to get the Christian support. But actually, his support amongst white evangelicals is much, much higher than his support amongst black African-American evangelicals. So it is more complicated than we sometimes think. I guess because they have had more of a tradition of social action, of civil rights, of battling for their rights and equality. And they are far less trusting of a Republican government to protect those rights than they are of a Democrat government, even if they've been very critical of the Democrats. So we do need to remember that when we talk about the Christian support for Donald Trump, it is racially divided. And that's quite an interesting and a disturbing thing, an aspect to it as well. It's something we don't often talk about. But for example, haven't got all the data out yet. But for example, in 2020, Trump gets something like 80% of the support in 2020 from white evangelicals. He only gets something like about 40% of the support from black evangelicals. Now, we haven't got all the data out from that yet, but for 2024. But I suspect it's going to be pretty similar, that high level of support amongst, let's say, Latino men, some of whom will be Catholics, and amongst white evangelicals, I suspect will be nowhere near as high. We'll have to wait and see a little bit amongst black evangelicals. So it is complicated, this.
I have a quick question as well, and I'm still waiting for you guys. Don't be shy. Ask your question as they're coming along. Would you think that potentially due to the election, because even though they were quite close, it was quite a close context, I would say, during the election, do you think that America may be a little bit divided, or they will all unify behind Donald Trump?
They're deeply divided. There's no question about it that Donald Trump has won a Democratic victory. There's no question about that. Interesting, actually. Remember when he lost? He told everybody the election was skewed and stolen. Now he's won. I noticed nobody's saying that. But anyway, exactly. I'll just park that for a moment for people to think about. Anyway, there we go. Although he has won decisively, and he has won decisively, no question about that. It is still a very, very divided nation. There are tens of millions of people who didn't vote for Trump. And those tens of millions of people who didn't vote for Trump probably do not have a lukewarm attitude towards him. They probably have a very, very strong attitude towards him. So I suspect, if you didn't vote for Trump, you are really very, very, very unhappy, as opposed to just a little bit disappointed, if you see what I mean. And when it comes to things like deportation of migrants, and when it comes to, I don't know, maybe backing out of support for Ukraine, for example, or climate change. I mean, Trump has called it a hoax and it's the biggest scam of all time. If America pulls out of Paris Accords and other climate change accords, there will be people who, and in my opinion, quite rightly, will be very, very concerned about that. So, no, I don't think this has healed America. No. I think America remains as deeply divided as ever, but Donald Trump is now the president.
What do you make of this administration? Obviously, you mentioned a big name, obviously Elon Musk, which is now going to be part of the government and kind of shaping up all the waste and so on. What's your take on it?
Well, it's quite interesting. Yeah, as a matter of interest, funnily enough, Musk and Ramaswamy are technically not going to be members of the government. The organization that they've been called in to manage will kind of sit alongside government and kind of look for cutting what's called waste and extravagance and so on. So that's a little bit kind of, what will that mean? The answer is the jury's out. Quite appropriate when it comes to Donald Trump, of course. But the jury's out. And we don't quite know what that's going to mean. The make of it so far is that those who've been appointed or invited to join the government are, not surprisingly, really Trump allies, really Trump loyalists. This is sort of, this is full fat Trump as opposed to Trump light. Harris was talking about the fact if she was elected, that she might invite some moderate Republicans to join her to try to create a unity government. You're not going to see that under Donald Trump. Now he's going to say, well, I won. End of story. I don't need to. But given the fact it is a very, very divided nation, you can see why Harris, for all her faults and failings, was thinking, I've got to kind of bring people together. I don't think for a moment we're going to see Trump trying to bring people together at all. I think we're going to get, full fat Trump as opposed to Trump light. I'm not referring to his weight or anything. I mean in terms of it's going to be the real deal. It's going to be the high sugar content. It's not going to be Trump light. And I think the appointments so far tend to show people who are very loyal to Trump, very strong on Trump approaches. And I think we're going to get full-blooded Trump. And what that means, of course, is the debate. Yeah, undiluted Trump. That's the word, yeah.
Well, somebody mentioned it on the chat, undiluted, actually. Well, we've got one question here, which is good. Please bring your question, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, or Zoom. Do bring your question. We want to make sure that you actually get as much as we can. One of our listeners here said, I just don't understand how a convicted felon make it to the highest government office. Will his convictions have any impact on his presidency?
Right. Short answer is probably no, because he now has the right to pardon himself. Well, does he, doesn't he? There'll be a big debate about that. He can pardon other people of federal charges. That's likely to go away now. The state charges, funnily enough, he can't pardon himself for. So, for example, the things that happened in New York and elsewhere, he can't pardon himself for those. But whether any of those will progress now, whether anybody will progress that now that he is president, I think is highly unlikely. I think that's all going to stall and collapse now. And they've been put on hold. That's right, exactly. So some of them have been put on hold. Some of them, discussion is, will they be put on hold? And we know, for example, that he can pardon himself of federal charges anyway. I think that's all going to stop now, basically. Yeah, I too thought that perhaps he'd been convicted and that these were mounting up would have been a problem for him. But I think those who supported Trump felt, and obviously people have their own views on this, that these were politically motivated attempts to bring him down, to control him, to punish him, and so on. I think that's a very flexible view of these. I think some of them were Democrat-driven things that were perhaps not the best thing to do. Some of them, I think, undoubtedly, I think he was caught and he was banged to rights. And end of the day, I think he was found guilty, and that's due process and the end of it. But certainly amongst many of his supporters, they've seen this as a kind of a witch hunt, a kind of a persecution of Donald Trump. So in a strange way, every time something came to trial, his his budgetary expenditure, the giving to him went through the roof. So it in no way kind of restricted or limited people's support for him. And I think basically, if you are an absolute Trump true believer, then you think all of this was a put-up job. And if you're not a Trump true believer, you think, well, okay, some of it may not have been the wisest things to do through the courts, but actually the man has been found guilty and it's genuine and he's going to get away with it. Trump divides people in a quite extraordinary way. We've never had somebody quite like Trump before. Not the president.
I can't see that happening here in the UK or even any other country in the world.
No.
Somebody be convicted and just getting away with it.
It actually couldn't happen in the UK because no prime minister would be able to make it go away if there were things going through the courts against him or her. So constitutionally, the UK might have all sorts of faults and failings, but a UK prime minister of whatever political party, just could not make legal jeopardy go away. Doesn't have the power to just pardon people, pardon themselves even. There was a big debate about can a president do that, but I suspect Donald Trump will stretch that one if necessary. That, for all the faults and failings in the UK, that can't happen. In our parliamentary democracy, the prime minister is definitely not above the law. In the USA, it's looking like a president might be above the law. And the Supreme Court even began to say, well, if some things can be judged as being done illegally, as some would say, but kind of using his powers, or it was necessary for him to do that as president, well, maybe that's okay. It's up to courts to prove the fact that it was illegal. Well, that simply could not happen in the UK. Things might be swept under the carpet, bad things may be done, but when it comes to due process, you just can't make it go away in the UK, or in most other parliamentary democracies, I hasten to add.
It's quite interesting. We have another question here for you. Is how much do you think the trans issue affected how people voted?
I think it is significant. I actually think I don't think it's the game changer. I don't think it won him the presidency, but I actually think it is quite important. I think that amongst many traditional American voters of both genders and of many ethnicities, if you were a traditional American voter, even if you weren't a person of faith, I think there have been real concerns about things like equal marriage, things like the trans issue. So while I don't think it won him the election, I think it didn't in any way help Harris head off some of the Trump attacks. And I think we will see that played out in a real rowing back of many of the legislative actions on, for example, trans and transitioning and so on. So viewers and readers may have the different views on this, but I think that in the American context, it weakened the support of Harris amongst wavering voters. I mean, people that were absolutely supporting of Harris, they will see this as being part of the American way of life. People that are totally against that in the USA, in a more traditional viewpoint, will be dead against it. But I think in the middle there were a lot of people who were just kind of uncomfortable about it, felt uncertain about it, and I think it will be one of those things which would have persuaded some people, probably in significant numbers, probably in significant numbers, not insignificant numbers, but probably numbers that are significant, let me rephrase it that way, to vote for Trump. So I think in that kind of wide cocktail of support for Trump, I think it's there. Yeah, I think it is.
Wonderful. Just going back into the foreign policies a little bit, just to touching on, we touched briefly on what Trump may or may not do in that sense. But before we touch on those foreign policy, once he got elected, there was, in terms of the economy, the Wall Street and all things went quite up very straight away, and obviously the market did affect it for a period of time and kind of leveled out over the last few days. And obviously we spoke about the Bitcoin as well, which if you read the news as well about the Bitcoin, that just went up and down. But in terms of this foreign policy, and this is why really I'm just a little bit concerned about him, because the fact that he's very unpredictable in that sense, type of kind of person, very unpredictable. We don't really know what's happening. It's quite an unstable world in certain part of the world as well already. So having somebody who's quite unpredictable, we don't really know what he's going to do. Is he going to put fire to the fuel? Is he going to kind of stuff, things going on. But what do you think in terms of, let's talk about Israel, for example. So we know that that's been going on. We talked about Israel about last year when we came in and we discussed about it. But what do you think America's position will be now in relation to Israel and the actual Middle East conflict?
I suspect that there will be very, very strong support for the Netanyahu government and the current Israeli administration. I think there'll be very little criticism of the way in which it's conducting the war in Gaza or in southern Lebanon. I suspect that in that sense, I suspect Netanyahu and the current Israeli administration are pleased with the return of Trump. I think he will definitely be taking firm action on Iran because he took very firm action before that. And the Israeli government, again, will be very pleased about that as well. But on the other hand, as I say, he sees himself as being the candidate of the deal, and I think he will try very hard to try to create a more normalized relationship between Israel and the Arab nations. I mean, countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on, because he sees himself as a deal maker, and the Abraham Accords, as they were called, which were set to normalize relations between Israel and key players, has been argued to be one of the factors that prompted Hamas to do the appalling things they did on October the 7th, because they felt they were being kept out, that Palestinians were being kept out of the arrangement, and they basically wanted to upset all of that by doing something appalling that would then lead to a shocking Israeli response that would then make it very hard for Arab states to then do deals with Israel. But some people feel that that was actually as a response to, and I think there's some truth to this, that was a response to the fact that under Trump, there had been an improvement of relationships between Israel and a number of key Arab states. I think he'll go for trying to create the deal there, try to make normalized arrangements in Israel and its neighbors. But as I say, the problem is, if you totally ignore the Palestinians, then all you do is you anger the Arab street. Many people in these other nations will be angry with their countries for doing deals with Israel, and it would not actually add to Israeli stability either. So the danger is that if he doesn't address the Palestinian issue, and I have a strong suspicion that he won't, then I think that any other deals that may actually be designed to increase Israeli security might in the long term actually undermine it, because it doesn't actually deal with this festering problem, which is the relationship between the current state of Israel and Palestinians. But I think we will see strong support for Israel, and I think we will see an attempt to try to create this kind of normalization of relationships between Israel and other Arab states, which of course has broken down very badly over the last year.
I mean, it's quite interesting you mentioned that. We've got a couple of questions coming up as well, but just on that point that you mentioned, it kind of normalized the situation here. Some people or some articles been written have been pointing out that Donald Trump could be the Antichrist if he was able to bring the 7 years treaty, in that sense, which, based on biblical prophecies. But the interesting thing is, right now, because it's so unstable and we don't really know what's happening with Trump and how he's going to do it, it's interesting why you point that one out. In relation to the next question, is in relation to Russia. The question is, what about his previous relationship with Putin and Russia? How do you think that may affect the relations with Ukraine?
Yeah, this is a really good question. The first thing I have to say is that that Trump is not a Russian agent. He's not getting his orders from Russia, and that's not a pro-Trump statement. It's just the reality of it. What he has an affinity with autocrats, people like the leader of North Korea, people like Putin, and that's a bit of a worry given the fact we live in a democracy and America is a democracy. But he's not taking his orders from Russia. The reason why the Russians like him and why they're quite happy to have him there is because they think he will cause chaos and instability. They think he'll cause problems in Europe. They think he'll be a problem for Ukraine because he will not be, fully in support of Ukraine. They think he'll weaken NATO. So Putin is not giving Trump instructions, and Trump is not getting instructions from Putin. He's not a Russian spy. He's not a Russian plant. But some of the things that he is inclined to do will give aid and support to Russia, who at the moment is desperate to kind of bring the Ukrainian war to an end, which allows it to keep the areas of the Donbass, that's in eastern Ukraine, around Luhansk, and will allow it to keep Crimea that it took illegally in 2014. And I think it sees in Donald Trump the real possibility of this kind of deal where Ukraine is given the offer, we'll safeguard your security if you'll accept the fact you've lost these areas. That'll be a very, very bitter pill for the Ukrainians to swallow, given the fact they have lost sovereign territory and given the fact they've lost vast numbers of lives. But that's why I think Putin supports him, because I think he thinks that he can benefit from any deal that Trump does. And I think he thinks also he can benefit from discord and disunity in Europe, because it's likely that we'll see America more semi-detached to Europe than at any time since the founding of NATO in the 1940s. And that is a real issue and a problem. Well, for Europeans, I think.
Thank you. Another question for you here is, what do you think of Elon Musk being front and center of his Trump government?
Yeah, really interesting. Really interesting. I mean, Elon Musk has really thrown himself behind Trump, hasn't he, over the last year or so? Well, ever since Trump took over X, formerly known as Twitter, we've seen a real loosening up of controls on misinformation and so on and so forth. I think we will see Twitter become much more, or even more, of a mouthpiece for extreme views. I think we will see Musk using his opportunity here to cut back on federal control and federal expenditure. And I think, when you are the richest person in the world, or one of the richest people in the world, sorry, and you support Donald Trump, it may well be for ideological reasons, but it may also be because you think you're going to get a benefit out of it. And call me Mr. Cynical, but I think people like Musk have supported Trump because they see that billionaires will benefit from tax cuts, etc., etc., etc. Although remember, it's many poor Americans who voted for Trump in. So can you please the billionaires and the ordinary people at the same time? Yeah, but certainly I think Musk is also a bit of a chaos candidate now, and I think his input and the way that X was Twitter goes after this is going to be very interesting to see. A lot of people are leaving Twitter, of course, because in protest. And in fact, funnily enough, you see, Twitter does not have anywhere near the clout that places like some other places like Instagram and TikTok and so on do. But the interesting point is that nevertheless, it is still a very, very influential thing when it comes to government. A lot of them use it.
That's wonderful. Another comment here saying it is such a travesty that Israel will not be held to account for what it is done to Palestine. What's your take on it?
Yeah, because I mean, if you ask me my personal view, what happened on October the 7th was appalling, terrible, horrific. I was horrified by that. Having said that, I think the response that's happened since then has been extremely shocking, terrible. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of people have died, tens of thousands have died in Palestine, in Gaza, for example. And I'm deeply shocked by that, because I would hope that any government's response to something as terrible as October the 7th would not itself cause the deaths of tens of thousands of women and children and civilians and so on. So I'm really shocked by this. And I think the simple matter is Israel will not be held to account under the Trump government, I'm afraid. One thing I must just say, remember we switched over to my phone because I was having trouble with my computer. I've got 20% of power left because we had to move across to it very quickly, if you remember. Suddenly go, which I hope will not happen. It's not because I'm being offended.
No worries, we're nearly done. Just a few more questions now. I've got one more for you.
We had a small crisis with the technology.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I think we're nearly done. One other question which we haven't really touched on, which is quite interesting, is about China. You know, we
Yeah.
haven't really heard a lot of China since this election. And the question is, do you think China is taking note and waiting in the wings?
Absolutely. I think Beijing is watching this very, very carefully. On one hand, it would be very concerned about Trump because it'd be thinking, if it puts a 40% tariff on Chinese goods and they have to retaliate, that's going to be really bad for Chinese exports. And the Chinese rely a great deal on exports for their economy. So they'll be really concerned about that. On the other hand, they'll also be looking at Ukraine and they'll be thinking, well, if he didn't fight for Ukraine, will he not fight for Taiwan? So I suspect the Chinese, if you had to say to them, what do you think about Trump? I think they'd say, well, do you want the good news or the bad news? From our perspective, the good news is we think he might not stand fair, full square behind Taiwan. Good news from the Beijing perspective, if you see what I mean. Bad news from the Beijing perspective. Oh, the last thing we want is 40% exports slapped on our stuff, and that's going to cause chaos to the world economy. Yeah, I think China, who's been remarkably muted, if you've noted, they haven't said very much. So I thought that question about waiting in the wings and watching, I thought was very pertinent. Yeah, I think you're right. I think they're standing just behind the curtains thinking, I'm not quite sure what to make of this yet. I think I'll just watch it carefully. Whereas Putin has obviously decided, I think I can take advantage from this.
Which is very interesting. One more question. I'm trying to understand it. You say, what is wrecking place in America regarding division? I feel the RA mean regarding what is wrecking place in America. RA might be regarding division, if I'm correct. Not sure exactly what it means.
So does that mean how divided it is America?
Yeah, I think it might be this question. I don't know whether the person who wrote it on care just confirmed that to us. That's what you meant.
Yeah. If that's what he did mean, very good question. It might be a different question, equally good. But if that's what was meant, I think America is deeply divided, and I think it will get more divided once Trump policies come in. Now, it doesn't mean to say Trump policies will fail, but I think they will divide people. They'll either say, yeah, this is the strong medicine America needs, or they'll say, oh, this is appalling. This is giving poison to the body politic. And I think America is as deeply divided as ever. I was in America, in the USA, actually, the week leading up to the election. Funnily enough, I flew back overnight when Americans were voting between the 4th and the 5th. And the people I spoke to there, very, very deeply divided, very, very deeply divided. And I think that division continues.
Do you think, and obviously that's maybe a bit of an extreme, but do you think we could potentially eventually head into some kind of civil war?
Well, I sincerely hope not. But people have said that America is kind of on the brink of what you might call a slow burn civil war. Not that literally people are going to secede from the Union or something, but you could potentially see significant unrest. Of the type of we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. If a large number of people feel that their interests are being ignored and things are being forced upon them. So I do worry about America. I worry about its stability, and I worry about whether it's in the beginning of a sort of slow burn civil war. Having said that, of course, Trump's victory does mean to say he has a very wide coalition behind him. He can say a large number of people do support me.
I've got a question here. I'm going to allow this person to ask this question. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, Martin, if you can ask your question. Feel free to... So Martin, if you're able to unmute you and then ask your question.
I've unmuted.
Yeah, go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Martin, it's something that you were saying earlier, and it's thoughts when it comes to China, Russia, Putin. Yes, we're going to look at America. We're going to look at the political side of the home life and the economy and everything else. I think Putin is also, it's America, so he's a major player on the world stage. With Ukraine, I think you're dead right. He's going to do a deal. That's why Putin's at, because he will get the deal on Ukraine.
Yeah.
No matter what Europe says, but he can work Europe. But that one, Trump, I think, will work Europe. But the two main players as a businessman, he knows Russia and China. For this reason, being the powers that they are and the communist countries that they are, they can have an influence on Iran and what Israel and all what's going on around in that area. He needs Russia, he needs China. So I think he'll do a deal with China, an economical deal. He will do the deal in Ukraine and for Putin, etc. And I think that's the main thing of Putin. I'm looking spiritually and from my Christian background and looking at it. There's a world thing going on, and he's there at the right time to make a platform for other things to happen concerning Israel and the Arab nations surrounding it, especially Iran. But he needs Russia and he needs China on his side.
Yeah, I agree.
Does that make sense, Martin?
Yeah, he has to deal with Russia and China. You're absolutely right. He has to do some kind of deal with them. The question is whether protecting America from Chinese imports will stop him from being able to do a satisfactory deal with China. It's going to be quite difficult to do China, that in fact restricts Chinese imports into America, that doesn't actually result in some sort of retaliation from China. But I think you're right. I think those will be very much on his agenda, trying to get peace in the Middle East, even if it means ignoring the Palestinians, which I think he will. I think he will strive to do that. One thing I would just mention, of course, just a small correction there. Russia isn't now a communist country. So with the collapse of communism in 1991, Russia is no longer a communist country. It's much more realistic to regard it as being a right-wing nationalist country now. Although I know Putin was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, but he too has been on a journey, and it's been a journey away from communism towards nationalism. That's just a smaller side there.
Wonderful,
No,
wonderful.
I think that's it. We're going to say, Mark, that's a valid point. Thank you for educating me on that. It's a very good, valid point on marriage. Thank you.
Thanks for your contribution. It's really much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, everyone, I think we are coming up to the end of the show, and I don't want to be told off. And by Martin, he's got 20% on his phone, so we don't want it to just disappear just like that. But thank you, everyone, for really joining us. Martin, again, thank you so much for your input and your knowledge as well. And we shall see you again at some shares in our show, potentially in January, as we're beginning to do more of this as well coming up. So guys, I want to thank you again so much for everything, for participating, for sending your question, and just to let you know that we will be having Revelation Hour back again from January once a month, and at time I will be teaching, and some of the time we'll be having guests such as Martin coming in as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening, and I shall see you in the new year. Bye, everyone.